When Jada and Janelle Rivers transferred to an elite, nearly all-white private high school, they knew it wouldn't be easy, but they never imagined what was waiting for them. From the moment they stepped through those polished gates, Ryan Mallory and his gang of bullies made it their mission to break them. The twins endured every insult, every shove, and every slur thrown their way. But when the bullying turned physical, they left the twins with no choice. What the bullies didn't know was that Jada and Janelle were black belts, trained by a father who taught them never to bow their heads to hatred. The bullies believed that they were picking on easy targets, but they couldn't have been more wrong. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The sun stretched across the grounds of Rosewood Hills Academy, casting a warm but unforgiving light over the neat lawns and tall brick buildings that stood like silent guards over the students gathering in small groups. Everything about the place spoke of money and old traditions, from the perfectly trimmed hedges to the polished stone walkways, as if the school had been built not only for learning, but to remind everyone who walked its paths exactly where they stood in the world. Jada and Janelle Rivers, moving side by side, felt that reminder heavy on their shoulders even before they reached the front steps. Their uniforms were perfect, their posture upright, and their faces held calm expressions. But beneath it all, they could feel the weight of every glance that followed them, every quiet word that slipped between the students they passed. They were used to stares. They were used to whispers, but this was something sharper, something colder. It wasn't curiosity. They could tell the difference. This was the kind of attention that came with judgment already made, with a line already drawn before they'd even had the chance to speak. It wasn't only because they were new, and it wasn't only because they were twins. It was because they were black. And here, that made them stand out more than anything else. Their father, Derek Rivers, had warned them it might be like this. He hadn't sugar-coated the world for them. He had taught them to expect moments like this, taught them to carry themselves with strength and pride, no matter what they faced. He made sure they could defend themselves if they ever had to, not only with words, but with skill and control that few their age possessed. Still, even with all his lessons, even with the years of preparation, stepping into this place felt like walking straight into a storm they could see, coming from miles away, but could not avoid. "Look at that," a boy's voice said, loud enough for them to hear without a shred of subtlety. He was leaning against a pillar near the front of the school, a smug grin stretched across his face as his friends chuckled beside him. "Twins," another boy added with a sneer, as if the word itself was an insult. "Didn't know they came in matching sets." Jada's eyes flicked toward them, catching the way they puffed up their chests, like they owned the space they stood in. She felt the burn of anger rise in her chest, but pushed it down just as fast. Their father's voice rang in her mind, calm and steady. "They want a reaction. Don't give it to them." Janelle's grip on her backpack strap tightened, her knuckles pale against the dark material, but like her sister, she kept her expression smooth and unreadable. The bond between them was stronger than words, and she knew Jada felt the same fire she did, smoldering beneath the surface, waiting. They didn't need to speak to understand one another. They had faced enough together to move as one, to think as one. They pushed forward without breaking stride, their eyes set on the doors ahead, ignoring the heat of the stairs burning into their backs like sunlight magnified through glass. The deeper they walked into the courtyard, the clearer the message became. This place wasn't built for them. The polished floors and towering windows, the gleaming trophy cases and proud banners hanging from the walls, All of it felt like a stage set for a play where they were never meant to have a role, but they kept walking. "Ignore them," Janelle said under her breath, her voice low but steady. More of a reminder than advice. She didn't look at her sister when she spoke, trusting that Jada would understand without needing to. "I see them," Jada answered, her tone quiet yet sharp beneath the surface. "But I won't give them the satisfaction." They reached the doors of the main building, tall and heavy, opening with a soft mechanical sound that felt too smooth for what waited on the other side. As they stepped inside, the chill of the air conditioning hit their skin, but it couldn't cool the fire building inside them. The students already gathered in the hallway turned to look, conversations pausing as eyes followed the twins through the corridor. Some faces held curiosity, others open hostility, and a few showed a flicker of something worse. Amusement, like they were waiting for the moment the new girls would fall out of place and give them all something to laugh about. Jada's gaze swept the hallway, reading it like a map of territory marked by invisible boundaries. She saw how the bullies stood in clusters near the lockers, how the girls whispered behind their polished nails, casting sidelong looks filled with quiet malice. Every detail sank in. Every glance felt like a challenge waiting to be answered. They knew this was only the beginning. The looks, the whispers, the sharp-edged words spoken just loud enough to sting, but quiet enough to deny if challenged. All of it was just the start of something that would build and build until it could no longer be ignored. But they were ready. They had faced worse than this. They had trained for storms just like this one. Though the sky over Rosewood Hills Academy seemed clear and calm, Jada and Janelle could feel the pressure building in the air, the promise of thunder waiting just beyond the horizon. They wouldn't be the ones to strike first. Their father had taught them better than that. But if the storm came to them, they would not run. And when it did come, it would be ready to meet something far stronger than it expected. The first days at Rosewood Hills passed exactly how Jada and Janelle had expected. But that didn't make it any easier to carry. From the moment they stepped into their first class, it became clear that every eye was waiting for them, not with welcome or curiosity, but with cold, quiet judgment. The classroom itself was neat and bright, sunlight spilling across clean desks and shining off polished floors, but no amount of light could hide the way the students and even the teachers treated them like they didn't belong. Teachers called their names without looking up, their voices flat, their attention already moving on, as if the twins were little more than a line on the attendance sheet. In the hallways, the crowd seemed to shift just enough to block their way, forcing them to step aside or move slower, all while pretending it was an accident. It wasn't. They knew it, and the students around them knew it too. But Jada and Janelle didn't give them the reaction they wanted. They kept their heads high, moved with purpose, and didn't let the tension force them into a corner. Even when the looks grew longer and the whispers sharper, they pushed through every day, steady and silent. It didn't take long for Ryan Mallory to show his face. He wasn't hard to spot. He acted like he owned the place, walking with a careless swagger that came from knowing the rules never really applied to him. His blonde hair was perfectly styled like he'd stepped out of a magazine, and he wore his uniform like it was a costume, loosening his tie and leaving his shirt untucked to show just how little he cared. "Hey!" Ryan called out one morning as the twins crossed the courtyard to their lockers. His voice was loud, confident, meant to grab attention. His friends gathered around him, laughing already, like they didn't even need to hear the joke to know it would be good. "You two get lost on the way to the servants' entrance?" he asked, his words clear and sharp in the open air. His friends broke out laughing, too loud for the weak insult, but they weren't laughing at the joke itself. They were laughing at the target. Janelle kept her eyes forward, her face calm, her steps even. She didn't give them the satisfaction of looking back. Jada's gaze flicked to Ryan for just a moment, sharp and steady. But she didn't stop walking either. She saw the smirk on his face, saw his friends nudge each other, feeding off the attention, and though her chest tightened with anger, she kept it beneath the surface. They both did, but Ryan wasn't finished. "Guess they don't understand English," he called out louder, making sure everyone nearby could hear. "Maybe we should try speaking their language." "What is it? Jungle talk?" The laughter that followed was worse this time. It spread through the crowd, pulling more students in, even ones who hadn't paid attention before. Now they were watching, waiting, some amused, some curious, none of them caring enough to stop it. Jada's jaw tightened, her teeth pressed together, but she took a slow breath, steadying herself. She could feel Janelle close by, her presence steady, like an anchor keeping her from drifting into the storm Ryan was trying to create. They kept moving. In the days that followed, things only got worse. Ryan's friends, Zach and Brent, stepped up their harassment. They made a game out of bumping into the twins in the hallways, knocking their books to the floor with fake apologies and smug looks that said they knew exactly what they were doing. Didn't know they were letting the janitors take classes now. Zach muttered one afternoon as he brushed past, just loud enough for the nearby students to hear. "Maybe they're just here for practice," Brent added with a smirk. "School's gotta keep the floors clean somehow." The twins said nothing. They picked up their books, straightened their backs, and moved on. But with every shove, every insult, the pressure built a little more, like a weight slowly pressing down on them, testing how long they could carry it before it crushed them. What made it harder was the silence from everyone else. No teachers stepped in, no students spoke up. Even the ones who didn't join in just turned away, pretending not to see. The teachers kept their eyes on their papers or their screens, unwilling to get involved, unwilling to admit that this perfect school had anything ugly lurking beneath its surface. At home, their fathers saw the signs, even though they tried to hide it. Derek Rivers had taught them how to fight, how to defend themselves with skill and control. But he had also taught them to see trouble coming, to recognize the quiet signals that warned of bigger storms ahead. Over dinner, he watched his daughters closely, reading the tightness in their jaws and the heaviness in their eyes. He didn't ask them directly, didn't push them to speak before they were ready. But when they finally told him, he listened without interruption. "You remember what I taught you," Derek said that night, his voice calm, but there was no softness in it. "Control is power. They want to get under your skin. Don't let them." Jada nodded, her mouth set in a firm line. Janelle matched her sister's determination, though her eyes carried a flicker of frustration that was getting harder to hide. "They're pushing," Jada said, steady but serious. "Harder every day. They will," Derek replied without hesitation. "They think you'll break. They want you to." "And if they don't stop?" Janelle asked, her voice just as steady, her meaning clear. Derek's eyes met theirs, and in that look there was no hesitation, no doubt. "Then they'll find out you're not the ones who break." His words hung in the air like a quiet promise, one the twins carried with them into the next day and the days that followed, letting it sit just beneath the surface of their calm expressions. They walked through the halls of Rosewood Hills with their heads high, knowing it wasn't a question of if things would escalate, but when. And that moment was coming fast. The days bled into each other, each one colder and more unforgiving than the last, as if the walls of Rosewood Hills had tightened around Jada and Janelle little by little, squeezing just enough to remind them that this place was never meant for them. And every passing hour felt like another test of how much they were willing to endure. They had kept their heads high through the stares and the whispers, through the cheap insults and the forced laughter of students who had long since learned that cruelty was rewarded here, not punished. But beneath their calm surface, they could feel the pressure building, steady and certain, like storm clouds gathering before a downpour. It was Ryan, of course, who decided that words and petty shoves were no longer enough. He had always wanted a bigger audience, always wanted to see how far he could push before something snapped, and now that he sensed the cracks forming, he wasted no time in planning something cruel enough to draw every eye in the school, something that would humiliate the twins in a way they could never brush off, no matter how strong they acted on the outside. The plan wasn't complicated, because it didn't need to be. Cruelty never did. Not when it was backed by confidence and a crowd willing to play along. It started in the morning, when Jada and Janelle arrived to find their lockers covered in ugly, hateful words, scrawled across the metal in thick, dripping red paint. The slurs were bold, shameless, left there for everyone to see. Black markers had been used to draw ugly, cartoonish faces with exaggerated features meant to mock them, the images twisted and dehumanizing. Crumpled papers had been shoved through the locker vents, all of them filled with more insults, each worse than the last, as if the bullies had taken turns to see who could write something more vile. As they stood there, shoulders squared, faces tight with control, the hallway around them erupted in laughter, sharp and cruel, with students stopping to point, to snap photos on their phones, to spread the moment like wildfire. Some laughed openly, loud and unrestrained, while others covered their mouths and pretended to hide their amusement. But it didn't matter. The twins saw it all, felt every jab like a needle under the skin. Ryan leaned against a nearby locker, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a grin stretched wide across his face, his eyes bright with victory. Zach and Brent flanked him, both of them looking pleased with themselves, their smug satisfaction clear in every angle of their posture. "Figured we'd give you some decorations," Ryan called out, loud enough for the whole hall to hear, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Thought it might help you feel more at home." The crowd roared with laughter, the sound rolling through the hallway like a wave crashing against the shore, relentless and loud. And for a brief moment, even the teachers who happened to pass by hesitated, their eyes lingering for just a second before they quickly turned away, pretending not to see, pretending it wasn't their responsibility. Janelle's hands curled into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep her breathing steady, her chest tight with anger that she struggled to hold back. She could feel her sister beside her, could feel Jada's fury burning just beneath the surface, held in check only by sheer force of will. They had endured the names. They had endured the shoves. But this was different. This was public, deliberate, a performance meant to strip away their dignity in front of the whole school. And as much as they tried to stay grounded, the weight of it pressed down harder than anything they had faced so far. Their father's words echoed in their minds, steady and clear, telling them to hold their control, to let their discipline guide them. But as the laughter kept rolling and Ryan stepped forward with a slow, mocking clap, they both felt that line growing thinner, that fragile line between patience and action. "You should say thank you," Ryan sneered, standing close now, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "Takes a lot of effort to make you two feel like you belong." The crowd hung on his words, eyes bouncing between him and the twins, waiting, hungry for a reaction, for even the smallest crack in their armor. Jada's eyes locked onto Ryan's, her stare hard and unflinching, and though she said nothing, the message in her gaze was clear as day. Janelle, standing just as steady, felt the same fire rising in her chest, her pulse quickening as she drew in a slow breath, steadying herself against the rising tide of fury. They wouldn't give him the reaction he wanted, not yet, but neither of them could pretend this would pass. They both knew something had shifted in that moment, something sharp and irreversible. This wasn't just another insult to ignore. This wasn't something they could sweep aside like the whispers in the hallway or the sneers from across the classroom. This was a line crossed, a challenge thrown at their feet in front of the entire school. As they cleaned their lockers later, wiping away the paint with rough paper towels handed to them by the janitor, who avoided their eyes and said nothing, Jada's voice broke the silence between them, low and certain, carrying a weight that had been building for far too long. "No more," she said, her tone quiet but steady as stone. Janelle didn't need to ask what she meant. She felt the same thing burning inside her, the same final crack running through the patience they had worked so hard to hold on to. She nodded once, sharp and sure. "No more," she agreed. The decision wasn't made in anger alone. It came from a deeper place, from the understanding that survival wasn't always enough, that there were moments when standing still meant giving away pieces of yourself that you could never get back. The moment was coming. They could feel it as clear as the air they breathed. Next time Ryan and his crew stepped forward, they wouldn't walk away. They would fight. And they would fight like they had been taught from the very beginning. The air at Rosewood Hills had not softened since the cruel prank. If anything, it had grown heavier, like something hanging in the atmosphere that nobody could see but everyone could feel. A tension stretched tight over the courtyard as students gathered in their usual spots, speaking just a little quieter, casting just a few more glances toward the paths they all knew the twins would walk. Jada and Janelle, side by side as always, felt every eye watching them, every whisper that swirled in the air like smoke too thick to ignore. But they kept their pace steady, their heads held high, their eyes forward yet fully aware of what waited for them just beyond the next turn. Ryan Mallory was already there, leaning against the sun-warmed stone wall with a look on his face that was a perfect mixture of boredom and cruelty, as if this moment was less about a decision and more about something he believed had already been decided. Zach and Brent stood on either side of him, their posture loose, but their eyes sharp, waiting for their moment, like wolves watching their prey step into reach. "There they are," Ryan said loud enough to pull the attention of every nearby student, the sound of his voice carrying across the courtyard like a flare shot into the sky, drawing a wider circle of onlookers who didn't even try to hide their curiosity. "Thought you two might have taken the hint and stayed home today." Jada's gaze, sharp and unblinking, found him immediately. She didn't stop walking, didn't flinch at the sound of his words, but there was no mistaking the way her eyes pinned him in place, steady and cold. "If that's what you were hoping," she answered smoothly, her tone even and clear for everyone to hear, "then you're even more pathetic than I thought." The crowd gave a low murmur, a ripple of surprise moving through the students as they caught the sharp edge of her words. Ryan's smirk twitched at the corners, and for a moment it faltered just enough to show the flash of annoyance beneath. "You've got a lot of nerve," Ryan snapped, straightening from the wall and taking a step closer, closing the space between them with the casual confidence of someone who had never once expected to be challenged. "Talking like that. Acting like you belong here." Janelle shifted her stance, squaring her shoulders, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of every insult they had swallowed, every cruel prank they had endured in silence until now. "We do belong here," she said firmly, her eyes locked on Ryan without a trace of hesitation. "More than you ever will. You walk around like you own this place, but deep down you know the truth. Without your little gang, you're just another coward hiding behind cheap jokes and weak friends." Her words struck deeper than she could have expected, cutting through the shallow armor Ryan wore like a mask. The crowd responded with a louder stir, students glancing at each other, sensing the moment shifting, feeling the ground under this confrontation start to shake. Ryan's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he closed the gap between them further, standing so close now that Jada could see the flicker of uncertainty behind his glare, though he masked it quickly with rage. "Say that again," he challenged, his voice tight and brittle, like glass about to crack. "You heard her the first time," Jada replied calmly, her gaze never wavering. "You just don't like the truth when it's said to your face." Ryan's chest rose sharply as he fought to hold on to his bravado, but the cracks were there for anyone to see. He turned his glare to the crowd, feeding off their attention, needing it to rebuild his confidence. "You think you're tough? You think you can stand there and run your mouths without paying for it? We don't think," Janelle said, her tone sharpening just enough to cut through the noise around them. "We know." That was the final push Ryan needed to abandon words altogether. His hand shot out without warning, slamming hard into Jada's shoulder, forcing her to step back under the sudden force, though she caught herself easily, her feet planting firm against the ground as if rooted there. The crowd's gasp rang loud and sharp, students drawing in their breath as the scene before them tipped from tension into open threat. Brent, seizing the moment, stepped toward Janelle, swatting her books from her arms with a cruel grin, sending pages scattering across the pavement in a messy sprawl that felt like an echo of the prank they had suffered days before. Zach followed, shoving hard into Janelle's shoulder, his voice dripping with mockery. "What now? You gonna run to Daddy?" That was the line crossed, clear as day, bold and undeniable. Jada's eyes burned into Ryan's, her voice calm but packed tight with the fire that had been building beneath her ribs for far too long. "No," she said, her breath steady, her words loud enough for all to hear. "We're done running." Without hesitation, she stepped forward, her movement fluid and controlled, and planted her palm against Ryan's chest with a sharp, practiced force that sent him stumbling back, his eyes wide with surprise as the breath shot out of him. At her side, Janelle moved just as smoothly, dropping low and sweeping Brent's legs from beneath him with precision, sending him sprawling across the ground with a heavy thud that silenced his laughter in an instant. The courtyard exploded with noise, students shouting, stepping back to form a wide circle around the fight, their faces split between shock and excitement as the twins took the moment fully into their hands. Ryan recovered quickly, but his usual cocky grin was gone, replaced by pure frustration as he rushed at Jada, swinging clumsily. But she saw it coming from a mile away, slipping beneath his swing and driving her fist into his stomach with tight, controlled power. Brent tried to scramble up, but Janelle was already there, catching his shoulder and twisting him down to the pavement once more, her movements sharp and sure, every step of her response shaped by years of training that flowed through her muscles like second nature. Zach lunged toward her, wild and desperate, but Janelle sidestepped cleanly, catching his arm as he charged past and flipping him down hard beside his friend, leaving both of them tangled and gasping for breath. Ryan, clutching his side, staggered back toward Jada with a snarl, but she met him with a clean strike under his chin, snapping his head back and forcing him to stumble away, his balance failing him as he tried to recover. The twins didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, didn't second-guess the choice they had made. Their father's lessons, drilled into them over long hours of practice, guided every move they made, every block, every counter, every strike. They were not here to perform for the crowd. They were not here to prove anything to anyone watching. They were here because the line had been crossed, and they were ready. The courtyard had become their arena, and as the fight unfolded with growing intensity, it became clear to everyone watching that Jada and Janelle were not the victims in this story. They were the reckoning. The courtyard, which had begun the day filled with lazy morning chatter and idle footsteps, now pulsed with energy so sharp and alive, it felt as though every brick beneath their feet had begun to hum with it. The circle of students had stretched wider, voices rising in a mixture of shock and thrill as Jada and Janelle moved like a storm finally unleashed, their bodies working in perfect sync, every strike and counter-landing with precision shaped not by wild anger, but by years of hard, patient training. And Ryan, forced back by the quick, punishing blows Jada delivered, tried to gather himself, but there was fear creeping into his eyes now, clear and unmistakable beneath the flush of his skin and the sweat starting to bead along his hairline. He had always believed himself untouchable, shielded by his numbers and his status, but none of that protected him now. Here, stripped of his usual smirking advantage, he stood face to face with someone who would not cower and would not yield. "You thought we'd just take it," Jada said, her breath controlled, her voice steady even as she dodged another wild swing and answered with a sharp elbow into Ryan's ribs that made him grunt and stagger sideways. "You thought you could keep pushing until we broke." Her words cut as deep as her strikes, and Ryan, still gasping for breath, found himself struggling not only against her fists, but against the truth of her voice, loud enough for everyone watching to hear and feel down to their bones. Brent, having scrambled to his feet, charged at Janelle with a frustrated snarl, but she met him head-on, slipping beneath his swing and driving her palm into his sternum with enough force to send him crashing backward, his body folding over itself as he hit the ground hard, gasping for breath that refused to come. "You picked the wrong fight," Janelle added, her tone sharp as steel as she watched Brent writhe on the ground before her, her eyes never leaving him as she took a single, measured step closer, making it clear that she would not give him the chance to rise again so easily. Zach, desperate to turn the tide, grabbed a broken piece of wood from the ground, something that had fallen loose from one of the benches, gripping it in both hands as he rushed toward Janelle with reckless force. But she saw him coming as if in slow motion, her senses sharpened by adrenaline and discipline, her body already moving to intercept. She sidestepped his charge with smooth precision, her hand snapping out to catch his wrist in a firm, unbreakable grip, twisting sharply to disarm him and send the makeshift weapon clattering harmlessly to the ground. With the same motion, she spun, driving her elbow into the side of his face and sending him crashing to his knees, dazed and defeated. "Cheap shots won't save you now," she said, her words low but clear, carrying across the circle of watching students who had fallen into a breathless silence, their earlier amusement replaced with something closer to awe and fear. Ryan, furious and embarrassed, lunged at Jada once more, his fists swinging wild and sloppy, driven by panic rather than skill. But Jada was already a step ahead, weaving under his attack and catching his wrist in a tight grip, twisting it sharply as she stepped into him and drove her knee into his stomach with brutal force. His breath exploded from his lungs in a choked sound as he collapsed to the ground, clutching his ribs. "You've had every chance to walk away," Jada said firmly, not just to Ryan but to every single person watching, her voice carrying the weight of everything she and her sister had endured up to this point. "But you kept coming." She let go of his wrist, letting him drop fully to the pavement, his body folding over itself as he struggled to breathe, his face contorted with a mixture of pain and disbelief. Janelle stood beside her sister now, her chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. The two of them side by side once more, just as they had been when they walked into this school. Only now the ground beneath their feet felt different, as if they had claimed it for themselves through sheer force of will. The crowd around them, once eager for spectacle, now stood in uneasy silence, the realization settling heavily over them that this was no ordinary fight, no simple exchange of blows between schoolyard rivals. This was something deeper, something final, a storm that had been building for far too long and had finally broken free. "Maybe now you'll learn," Janelle said, her voice cutting through the thick, charged air, "that we're not the ones you can push around." As if driven by stubborn pride alone, Brent tried once more to rise, but Janelle was there before he could fully lift himself, planting her foot firmly on his chest and pressing him back down to the ground with undeniable authority. He grunted in frustration, trapped beneath the weight of his own arrogance and her unwavering strength. "Stay down," she warned him, not as a threat, but as a fact, as unshakable as the ground beneath them. Jada's eyes swept the courtyard, meeting the gaze of every student brave enough to hold it, her expression steady and unyielding. She didn't need to speak the words aloud, because they were written clearly across her face. This ends here, and it ends now. But even as the twins stood victorious over the bullies who had tormented them for weeks, they knew this was not the true end of the battle. They could feel it in the way the crowd shifted uncomfortably, in the way teachers had yet to arrive, in the way whispers were already starting to rise, filled with twisted versions of what had just happened. They knew there would be consequences, that victory came with its own cost, but they did not regret their choice, not for a single moment, because for the first time since they had stepped onto this campus, they had made it clear to everyone watching that they were not to be underestimated, not to be toyed with, not to be humiliated without facing the price. The twins stood tall, their breath steady, their eyes unblinking as they watched the defeated boys writhe on the ground. The fight might have ended for now, but the storm had only just begun. The aftermath of the fight did not unfold in chaos, as one might have expected, but rather in a strange, stretched silence that seemed to pull at the corners of every moment, drawing out the weight of what had just happened until it felt heavy enough to press down on every person who had witnessed it. Even as the bullies lay groaning on the pavement, clutching at bruised ribs and nursing their wounded pride, the crowd that had once cheered for their cruelty now stood frozen, their earlier hunger for spectacle replaced by a cautious, almost guilty quiet. No teacher had arrived during the fight. Not a single adult had stepped in to stop what had unfolded in plain sight. But now, as though summoned by the heavy air left behind, they began to trickle onto the scene, their expressions tight with confusion and concern, though none of them could feign true surprise. Deep down, they had all seen this coming, or at least they had sensed the inevitability of something breaking beneath the surface of the polished school walls, and now that it had, they could no longer pretend ignorance. "Enough!" came the sharp voice of Mr. Carpenter, the assistant principal, as he pushed through the circle of students, his eyes scanning the scene with a look that landed somewhere between outrage and relief that he had arrived only after the violence had ended. His gaze swept from the injured boys sprawled across the courtyard to the twins standing tall at the center of it all, their breathing controlled, their posture strong, their faces set with an unflinching calm that made it impossible to pretend they were anything other than the victors. "What is going on here?" Carpenter demanded, though the question hung in the air more as a formality than genuine inquiry, because it was clear from the scene before him exactly what had unfolded. Before Jada or Janelle could answer, Ryan coughed painfully and forced himself to speak through gritted teeth. They attacked us," he gasped, his voice thick with desperation and fear, but also with the familiar entitlement of someone who believed he could still control the story if he spoke it first. "We didn't do anything. They just went crazy." The crowd shifted, uneasy, their silence beginning to crack under the weight of the lie. Some students glanced away, unwilling to meet the eyes of the twins or the adults now gathering, while others stared at Ryan with uncertainty, as if unsure whether to follow his lead or to finally acknowledge what they had seen with their own eyes. Jada's jaw tightened, but she held her composure, her father's voice echoing in her mind, steady and unyielding. "Control is power. Speak only when it matters." She met Carpenter's gaze directly, her eyes clear and sharp, and said in a firm, even tone, "They've been targeting us since we arrived. Today, they pushed it too far. We defended ourselves, nothing more." Carpenter's expression flickered, a brief moment of discomfort crossing his features before he masked it behind the tight professionalism that Rosewood Hills demanded from its staff. "We'll sort this out inside," he said, though there was no real promise in his words, no assurance of fairness. "All of you, come with me." The twins did not protest. They exchanged a quiet look between them, a glance filled with unspoken understanding, and fell into step behind Carpenter as he led the small group away from the courtyard, leaving behind the scattered crowd of students whose excitement had curdled into unease. Inside the administrative offices, the walls felt closer, the air cooler, but none of it dulled the fire burning beneath the twins' calm exterior. They sat side by side in the stiff chairs outside the headmaster's office, their hands resting on their knees, their eyes fixed ahead as Ryan, Zach, and Brent exaggerated their injuries to anyone willing to listen, casting themselves as victims in a story they had twisted beyond recognition. Soon enough, their father arrived, his steps measured, his face composed, though beneath his quiet exterior lay a storm just as fierce as the one that had driven his daughters to defend themselves. Derek Rivers entered the office with the steady confidence of a man who had seen far worse than this and had come prepared for every possibility. His eyes moved to his daughters first, checking them not just for injury but for steadiness of spirit. And when they met his gaze, strong and unbroken, a flicker of pride passed between them. He turned then to the headmaster, a man named Harrington, whose suit was as crisp as his expression was pinched, as though he had been forced to step away from something far more important than the well-being of his students. "We will be conducting a full investigation," Harrington said, his tone clipped, his hands folded neatly in front of him on the polished desk. "But in the meantime, I'm afraid both of your daughters will be suspended until we can review the facts." Derek's voice, when it came, was calm but carried the weight of stone. "My daughters were defending themselves. That much is clear, but I expected as much from this place." Harrington's eyes narrowed at the quiet accusation in Derek's words, but he said nothing to deny it, offering only a thin, tight-lipped nod. Ryan's parents arrived not long after, and the air in the room thickened at once. Sandra Mallory swept into the office like she owned it, her sharp heels clicking against the floor, her eyes burning with fury masked behind a thin veil of practiced concern. Her husband, Greg, followed close behind, his broad frame stiff with anger, his jaw set tight as he shot a glare toward Derek and the twins. "This is unacceptable," Sandra snapped before anyone could speak. "Our son has been assaulted, and you're telling me these girls, these violent girls, are simply being suspended? They should be expelled, arrested." Her voice rose with each word, and though Harrington attempted to soothe her with vague promises of further action, it was clear Sandra Mallory would not be satisfied until the twins were punished beyond reason. Derek's gaze never left her, his eyes steady and unreadable, but his daughters could feel the tension in him, not wild or uncontrolled, but the same controlled force he had taught them to carry. He watched her rage burn like dry kindling, feeding itself on lies and arrogance, and he let her speak her fury until her words ran thin. "This isn't over," Sandra hissed finally, her eyes narrowing to sharp points as she turned her glare fully on Derek, as if daring him to respond. "No," Derek replied evenly, his voice low and calm. "It's not." The weight of his words hung heavy in the room, not as a threat spoken in haste, but as a promise forged in certainty. As the twins rose from their chairs, their suspension papers handed to them with cold efficiency. They held their heads high, their posture unbroken, their eyes clear. The fight in the courtyard had ended, but a new fight had begun, one that would not be settled with fists alone. And as they stepped out of the office, their father walking between them, they understood with perfect clarity that whatever came next, they would face it together. The house stood quiet beneath the late afternoon sky, the soft hum of distant traffic, and the rustling of leaves in the breeze, offering a calm that felt almost too still, as if the storm that had started in the halls of Rosewood Hills had chased them home, but, for a brief moment, lingered just beyond the horizon, waiting for the right moment to break through. Inside, the air was heavier than usual, not with fear or regret, but with the weight of understanding that what had unfolded at school was not the end of the trouble. They had known it would follow them. They had known the Mallorys would not let it rest. Derek sat at the kitchen table, his posture relaxed but never careless, his eyes fixed on the open window that overlooked the quiet street, as if he could already see what was coming long before it arrived. His daughters sat across from him, the three of them gathered not in silence, but in shared readiness, their bond thicker than blood, reinforced by everything they had endured and everything they had fought for that day. "You knew they'd come here," Jada said, her voice steady, not asking a question, but stating a fact they all understood without needing to say it out loud. Her father gave a single, small nod, his eyes still watching the street, his mind already walking the steps ahead of him. "People like them," Derek replied, his tone calm, his words even. They don't accept losses quietly. They tell themselves they're entitled to win, no matter the truth. And when they lose, they bring the fight to your doorstep, thinking they'll find you unprepared. Janelle's gaze flicked toward the window, her hands resting flat on the table, her fingers loose but ready, her mind turning over her father's words with the same precision she applied to every move she had made in the courtyard. "They think we're finished because we walked away," she said, her tone low but sharp. "But they've never understood what strength really looks like." Before Derek could answer, the sound of tires crunching against gravel carried through the air, clear and sharp as a warning bell. They heard the car doors slam next, heavy and angry, followed by the unmistakable stomp of expensive shoes against pavement, a rhythm of entitlement and rage drawing closer to their front door with every step. "They're here," Jada said quietly, though the words were unnecessary. There was no mistaking it now. Derek rose from his chair in a single, fluid motion, his presence filling the room not with tension, but with solid, grounded certainty. "Stay behind me," he told his daughters, not because he feared what was coming, but because he wanted them to see how a battle was fought when it crossed the threshold of their home. He wanted them to see that strength was not always measured in fists alone, but in the way you stood your ground when the world tried to shove you back. Before the doorbell could ring, before the knock could fall, Derek opened the door himself, stepping out onto the porch with the quiet authority of a man who had faced down storms far greater than the one standing before him now. Sandra Mallory's face was twisted in a mask of fury, barely held together by the thin thread of social civility, her eyes burning beneath perfectly styled hair and expensive sunglasses perched on her head like a crown of false superiority. Greg Mallory stood beside her, his broad frame stiff with barely contained anger, his jaw tight as his fists flexed at his sides, the veins in his neck standing out like cords stretched too tight. "You think you can get away with this?" Sandra spat, not bothering with any form of greeting, her words sharp and fast as she stepped closer to Derek, her heels clicking hard against the concrete. "You think you can lay your hands on our son, and there won't be consequences?" Derek's expression remained unchanged, his gaze steady and unwavering as he met her fury with the calm of a mountain against the wind. "Your son attacked my daughters," he replied, his voice low but carrying enough strength to fill the space between them completely. "They defended themselves. That's the truth, whether you choose to accept it or not." "Don't you dare play the victim here," Greg snapped, his voice rough, almost trembling with rage as he took a half-step forward, his posture aggressive, his fists still clenching and unclenching as if itching for an excuse to strike. "Your girls are animals, just like you, and you've got the nerve to act like you're innocent?" The words hung in the air like a foul stench, drawing a cold stillness over the moment. But Derek did not rise to the bait. He let the insult sit between them, let it expose more about the man in front of him than any argument could have. And then he answered, not with fury, but with absolute clarity. "You've already made up your mind about who we are," Derek said, his tone smooth as stone, "but that doesn't change the facts. You raised a bully, and today he found out what happens when bullies cross the wrong line." Sandra's face twisted deeper in anger, her mouth opening to spit another insult, but before she could speak, her husband stepped past her, too far gone in his own rage to hold himself back any longer. "You think you can talk down to us in our own town?" Greg growled, his voice rising as he swung a wild, heavy fist at Derek. His face flushed with fury, his eyes wide with blind certainty that force would win where words had failed. But Derek was already moving, already turning his body with practiced ease, his hand rising to catch Greg's wrist mid-swing. The force of the blow arrested completely by the strength in Derek's steady grip. Greg's eyes went wide with surprise as Derek twisted his arm just enough to throw him off balance, guiding him to stumble sideways before releasing him without wasting a drop of energy. "You've made your choice," Derek said evenly, his eyes hard as iron. "Now you'll live with the consequences." But Greg, too angry and too foolish to see reason, charged again, this time with both hands raised in a clumsy attempt to wrestle Derek down, as if brute strength could overpower years of discipline and skill. Sandra, shrieking something unintelligible, tried to follow, her hands clawing at Derek's arm, her fury a storm of wild, uncontrolled rage. Derek moved with clean precision, stepping back just enough to draw both of them forward, using their momentum against them. He caught Greg's arm again, pulled him off balance, and sent him sprawling onto the porch floor with a thud that rattled the wooden boards. Sandra swung at him wildly, but Derek caught her wrist just as smoothly, twisting her arm behind her back with careful, practiced control that left her trapped, her breath hissing through clenched teeth. "You came to my home," Derek said quietly, his voice carrying not just power, but finality. "You thought you'd bring fear into this house, but fear doesn't live here." And with those words, the truth of it settled over the moment completely, undeniable and absolute. For a moment, there was a frozen stillness on the porch, the kind of moment that feels stretched so thin it could snap with the smallest touch. The Mallorys trapped between fury and fear. Derek holding Sandra firmly in place, while Greg scrambled awkwardly to push himself up from the wooden boards beneath him, his pride more battered than his body, but his eyes still full of blind rage that refused to let him see the futility of what he was doing. His face was flushed deep red, veins bulging at his temple, jaw tight as he tried to swallow his humiliation and turn it back into aggression, though anyone watching could see his bravado was wearing thin under the weight of reality. "You let me go!" Sandra hissed, twisting against Derek's steady grip, her voice sharp with panic that she tried to disguise as anger. But it cracked beneath the surface, the strain bleeding through no matter how hard she fought to keep her composure. "Do you know who we are?" Derek's eyes, steady and cold, did not flicker once as he held her wrist firm, not tight enough to hurt her, but tight enough to leave no doubt who controlled this moment. "I know exactly who you are," he answered, his voice even and low, his gaze sharp as a blade honed over years of quiet battle. "And it doesn't impress me." Greg, now back on his feet, charged again without thinking, his movements sloppy with anger, his body lunging forward in a way that revealed he had never truly learned to fight, only to dominate with brute force and the assumption that no one would ever push back. But Derek had seen this kind of man before, too many times to count, and he sidestepped Greg's charge with ease, pivoting smoothly and using his opponent's momentum to drive him straight into the porch railing, the wood creaking under the weight of the impact. "You think this is over?" Greg barked, even as he staggered back, trying to catch his breath, spitting his words through gritted teeth like they might carry some weight now that his fists had failed him. "You're finished. You and your girls, all of you." Derek's reply was calm, stripped of all fury because it needed none, only the clean, undeniable truth. "No," he said, stepping toward Greg with the quiet power of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. "You are." Greg threw another punch, wild and desperate, But Derek caught his arm once more, locking it tight in his grasp, before twisting him around and slamming him down onto the porch floor, flat on his back. The breath knocked from his lungs in a hard gasp that left him sputtering beneath Derek's shadow. Sandra screamed, her panic no longer hidden as she tried to tear herself free, clawing at Derek's arm with shaking hands. But her movements were erratic, full of fear that had finally risen to the surface now that she saw her husband laid low. Derek released her wrist, not because she had forced him to, but because he no longer needed to hold her. Her strength was gone, drained out of her in the blink of an eye as she stumbled back, her chest heaving with frantic breaths. The twins stood just inside the doorway, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them, their faces carved with quiet focus, not fear. They watched their father handle the Mallorys not with wild aggression, but with controlled precision. Every movement, a lesson they had seen in practice, but now witnessed fully alive, a living example of the discipline he had spent their lives teaching them. "This is what they always do," Derek said, loud enough for both the Mallorys and his daughters to hear, his words steady and strong as he stepped over Greg's groaning form. "They think they can walk into our space, into our lives, and break us with threats and violence. But they forget. We don't fold. We stand." Sandra's eyes darted toward her husband, who lay struggling to breathe, and then back to Derek, her lips parting as though she meant to speak, to spit another threat or excuse. But no words came. Her breath stuttered in her chest, her rage swallowed whole by the weight of her own helplessness. "Call the police!" she shrieked at last, her voice cracking under the strain of her panic. "Call them! He attacked us!" But even as she screamed the words, there was a hollowness to them, a shaky weakness that made it clear she no longer believed her own cries. "You came here," Derek reminded her, never raising his voice, but letting each word settle like a stone dropping into still water, rippling out until there was no escaping it. "You brought violence to my door, and now you'll live with what you brought." Greg, still gasping on the porch floor, managed to lift himself onto one elbow, his eyes wild with disbelief as he stared up at Derek, seeing not just the man in front of him, but everything he had underestimated, everything he had failed to understand until this moment had stripped him of all his false power. Sirens, distant but growing louder, began to echo through the neighborhood, the approaching sound slicing through the heavy air like a blade. Neighbors had emerged from their houses, drawn by the noise and the chaos, their faces etched with a mix of curiosity and quiet satisfaction, as if they too had grown tired of the Mallorys' arrogance, and now watched with silent approval as justice unfolded on the front porch of the Rivers home. Derek didn't move, didn't flinch at the sound of the sirens. He stood tall, unshaken, his daughters beside him, their eyes clear and proud as they watched the scene play out. Whatever the police would bring next, they were ready, because they had already won the battle that mattered most. This fight was never about the punches thrown or the bruises left behind. It was about standing firm when others expected them to fall, about showing the Mallorys, the school, and the entire town that their strength could not be taken, could not be broken, no matter how hard they were pushed. As the flashing lights rounded the corner and the first patrol car pulled into the driveway, Derek's voice broke the heavy silence one final time, carrying across the porch, across the yard, and into the memory of everyone who stood witness. "You came looking for a fight," he said, his tone unshakable, his presence as solid as the ground beneath him. "Now," You found it. The flashing blue and red lights washed over the front of the house, pulsing against the walls and windows in slow, steady waves, as though the storm that had thundered across their doorstep was not finished, but merely changing shape, trading fists and fury for the cold authority of uniforms and badges. Derek remained still at the center of it all, his daughters flanking him at either side, the three of them framed by the doorway like an unbroken line of defense against the chaos that had tried so hard to breach their home. The first officers stepped from their vehicles with practiced caution, their hands near their belts, their eyes sweeping over the scene as they read the details in silent calculation. The two bodies on the porch floor, disheveled and breathless, the man standing tall before them, composed and unwavering. The neighbors gathered at the edges of their lawns, watching with tight expressions, some crossing their arms, some whispering to each other beneath the siren's fading echo. Sandra Mallory's voice cut through the tension first, sharp and frantic, rising in volume as she rushed toward the officers, her arms waving as though she could pull them fully onto her side by sheer force of desperation. "Officer! Officer! Arrest him!" she demanded, pointing an accusatory finger at Derek, her face flushed with anger and something deeper beneath it, fear, raw and poorly hidden behind her rage. "He attacked us! We were defending ourselves, and he assaulted us in our own community." Her words tumbled over each other in a rush, growing more breathless with each accusation. But the lead officer, a man whose badge read Klein, did not react with immediate acceptance. He held up a steady hand, his eyes scanning not just Sandra but the whole scene, reading it with the quiet experience of someone who had seen enough of life's messes to know that truth rarely lived on the surface. "Ma'am," Officer Klein said, keeping his tone measured and professional, "I need you to step back and take a breath. We're going to sort this out, but I need to hear from everyone, and I'll start by speaking to the homeowner." Sandra opened her mouth to protest, but something in Klein's steady gaze stopped her short. She let out a sharp breath, her chest rising and falling as she stepped back beside Greg, who still lay groaning on the porch floor, holding his ribs with one arm as though the pain in his body could somehow lend more truth to his words when his turn came to speak. Officer Klein approached Derek next, his eyes cautious but not hostile, his tone neutral. "Sir, can you tell me what happened here?" Derek met the officer's gaze directly, his posture steady, his voice calm and even as he spoke. "They came to my home uninvited," he explained, not rushing his words, letting each one settle with weight and clarity. "They came angry about an incident at the school involving our children. They confronted me on my porch. They shouted threats. And then Derek motioned with a slight nod toward Greg, threw the first punch. I defended myself and my family." "And your daughters?" Klein asked, his eyes flicking toward Jada and Janelle, who stood silent but strong beside their father. "They witnessed everything," Derek replied without hesitation, his tone firm. "They did not engage. They stayed inside, just as I instructed them to." Klein gave a small nod, his gaze thoughtful, weighing Derek's words against the scene laid out before him. He turned next to Sandra and Greg, his notepad in hand, ready to hear their side, though it was clear from the quiet tightness of his expression that he had already begun to piece together the truth. Sandra launched into her version of the story with the same breathless desperation she had shown earlier, weaving lies with practiced ease, painting herself and her husband as victims of an unprovoked assault, their words dripping with entitlement as they cast Derek in the role of aggressor. But Her performance faltered beneath the steady gaze of Officer Klein, who made no move to interrupt, but whose eyes darkened with quiet skepticism the longer she spoke. "And you claim you were defending yourselves?" Klein asked once she finished, his tone carefully neutral, but edged with the weight of doubt. "We came here to talk," Sandra insisted, her voice rising again, but the cracks were clear now, her composure fraying at the edges as she struggled to maintain her narrative. "He attacked us!" Klein's eyes narrowed slightly, and then, as if sensing that the words alone were not enough to unravel the truth, he turned to the growing cluster of neighbors standing at the edges of their yards, some holding their phones, others speaking quietly among themselves. "I'm going to need witness statements," Klein called out, his voice carrying across the lawn with quiet authority. "Anyone who saw what happened, step forward." There was a long beat of silence, heavy and uncertain, and then, slowly, as though spurred by a shared sense of justice that had waited too long for its moment, a neighbor stepped forward from across the street. An older man, with a lined face and sharp eyes that missed nothing, he cleared his throat and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "I saw the whole thing," he said, his voice firm. "They came here shouting from the moment they stepped out of their car. The man threw the first punch. The homeowner never moved until they forced his hand. Another neighbor followed, then another, their voices weaving together to form a clearer picture, a chorus of truth that cut through Sandra's lies like sunlight through fog. Each account confirmed what Derek had already said, their words steady, their memories sharp. Klein listened to every word, his pen moving steadily across his notepad. And when the last neighbor had finished speaking, he closed the pad with a quiet snap that seemed to echo louder than the sirens had minutes before. "We're going to continue this at the station," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But based on what I've heard so far, it looks like we have more questions for you two." His eyes settled on Sandra and Greg, their faces pale and drawn beneath the harsh flash of police lights. Officers moved in to assist Greg to his feet, cuffing him gently but firmly as Sandra's protests rose again, thinner now, weaker, her voice trailing off into helplessness as the weight of reality pressed down hard and final. Derek stood unmoving as they were led away, his daughters at his side, his breath slow and steady, his gaze fixed not on the Mallorys, but on the horizon beyond them, where justice, at long last, was beginning to find its place. And though the night was far from over, though questions would still need answers, and shadows would still need to be cleared away, there was no mistaking the shift that had begun. The tide was turning, and this time it was turning in their favor. The station had the cold stillness of a place that saw too many lives pressed into its walls, too many voices raised in panic or protest, too many truths twisted beneath the weight of assumptions. Yet, as Derek and his daughters sat in the plain metal chairs of the waiting area, there was no fear in them, no tremor in their hands or in their breathing, only the quiet, measured patience of a family that had faced storms far greater than this, and knew that the only way through was to stand firm and let the truth rise, slow and unstoppable, like the tide against the rocks. Officer Klein moved between desks and filing cabinets with the focus of a man who understood the shape of a lie the moment it passed his ears, who had seen too many scenes, like the one now unfolding, to mistake noise for truth. He worked methodically, gathering statements, reviewing the accounts of the neighbors who had already begun to fill out written testimonies, and checking the footage from nearby doorbell cameras that had been offered up without hesitation by residents eager to see justice done properly for once. Derek watched him quietly, his eyes following every step, not with suspicion, but with a cautious respect for the man's diligence. He saw in Klein not the quick judgment of a man eager to close a case, but the slow, steady patience of someone who knew that real answers came not from who shouted the loudest, but from who stood the longest on solid ground. Jada and Janelle sat close to their father, their posture upright, their faces calm, though inside both felt the slow churn of everything they had endured, everything they had carried, rising to the surface as the walls of the station seemed to close in and the long wait stretched further. Yet even through the quiet tension, they did not falter. They had faced worse storms and come through unbroken, and they knew they would come through this one the same way. Klein approached at last, his notepad tucked under one arm, his expression thoughtful, lined with the weight of what he had gathered. He paused before them, clearing his throat gently before speaking. "Mr. Rivers," he began, his voice careful but firm, "I've reviewed the neighbor statements and security footage, and it's clear you didn't start the confrontation. It's also clear your actions were defensive." Derek offered a small nod, acknowledging the officer's words without triumph, without relief, but with the quiet steadiness of a man who expected nothing less from the truth. Klein continued, shifting his weight slightly as he glanced at his notes. "What's more, the footage we've collected also shows that the Mallorys came to your property aggressively. They crossed onto your porch first. They raised their voices, and they initiated physical contact. Multiple angles confirm this." A soft breath passed between Jada and Janelle. Not quite a sigh, but the slow release of held tension. A moment of quiet reassurance settling in their chests, like a small flame that refused to go out, no matter how much wind had battered it. "However," Klein went on, his tone still even, "given the severity of the injuries and the Mallorys' claims, we'll need to document everything fully. There will be formal statements, a full report, and there may still be legal proceedings. But I want you to know," he added, his gaze settling on Derek with something that felt almost like respect, "from what I've seen, the evidence is clearly in your favor." Derek's reply came without hesitation, his voice low and sure, "We'll give you every answer you need." As they followed Klein into the interview room, Jada and Janelle felt the weight of the moment settle deeper into their bones, not as a burden, but as a reminder of everything they had endured to reach this point. They sat beside their father, answering questions with clarity, recounting the events of the day with steady voices that carried the full truth of their experience, not leaving room for doubt or distortion. Piece by piece, the story unfolded under the watchful eyes of the officers, not as a twisted tale spun from fear and bias, but as a clean, unbroken chain of facts that led from the first shove in the courtyard to the final confrontation on their doorstep. They told of the days of harassment, of the cruel prank that had pushed them to the edge, of the fight forced upon them by boys who believed they could do anything without consequence. They spoke not as victims, but as survivors, and as their story filled the room, the shape of the truth became impossible to deny. Later, as they stepped out of the interview room to a quieter corner of the station, Derek turned to his daughters, his voice soft, but carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "You see how it works," he said, not as a lesson, but as a reminder of what they already knew in their bones. They'll twist the story, try to make it theirs, but the truth is patient. It waits, and when it's time, it stands tall. Jada met his gaze, her eyes bright with resolve. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice firm. Janelle nodded beside her, her expression just as steady. But we're getting there. Klein approached again, a faint tightness in his jaw as he flipped open his notepad once more. There's something else, he said, his tone cautious but not hesitant. One of your neighbors mentioned something about earlier trouble at the school. We're going to pull surveillance footage from the school property as well. If there's a pattern, it'll help clear this up faster. At those words, a quiet ripple of understanding passed between Derek and his daughters. They had carried the weight of the bullying alone until now, had endured in silence while the school turned a blind eye. But if the truth of those days could finally come to light, then this battle would not only clear their names, it would expose the rot that had festered beneath Rosewood Hills for far too long. Do it, Derek said without pause. Let the whole story come out. Klein gave a small nod and stepped away to make the call, his movements efficient, his purpose clear. As the quiet of the station settled around them once more, the twins and their father sat together, steady and unshaken, knowing the storm had not fully passed, but also knowing the tide had turned irreversibly in their favor, and no matter what came next, they would be ready. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights filled the station with a low, steady buzz, a sound that might have been insignificant in any other moment, but here, under the weight of what was unfolding, it seemed to underline every passing second, stretching time as the final pieces of truth began to slide into place. Derek sat with his daughters close beside him, the three of them a steady line of resolve in a room that had grown tight with tension, the atmosphere thick with the scent of papers, ink, and the slow burn of justice that was beginning, at last, to catch fire. Across the room, through the narrow glass panels of the adjoining office, they could see Sandra and Greg Mallory seated at a separate table, their posture fraying under the pressure that was building around them. Sandra's sharp features, once held together with the confidence of entitlement, had begun to crack, her eyes darting from one officer to another, her mouth pressed into a thin line as though she was trying to hold back the fear that trembled just beneath her surface. Greg sat heavier in his chair, his shoulders slumped in a way that spoke of more than just physical pain, his gaze avoiding the window, avoiding Derek's eyes, avoiding the inevitable. Officer Klein returned to the room, a folder thick with printed photographs and reports tucked beneath his arm, his expression sharpened by the clarity that only undeniable evidence could provide. He moved with a sense of purpose that filled the space between them, pulling a chair closer to the table before he set the folder down and flipped it open, the first page catching the harsh light overhead. A still image pulled from a neighbor's security camera, showing Greg Mallory mid-swing, his face twisted in anger, his fist flying toward Derek's head. Without a word, Klein spread the images across the table, each one more damning than the last, capturing the escalation frame by frame, the truth laid bare in a sequence of moments too clear to deny. There was no confusion in the photographs, no room left for twisting stories or fabricating excuses, only the plain, undeniable fact that the Mallorys had brought their fury to Derek's doorstep and ignited the confrontation with their own hands. Derek's gaze remained steady on the images, his face composed, his breath slow and even, not because the evidence surprised him, but because it confirmed what he had known from the start, that the truth, though it may have been delayed, had never strayed from their side. We've also pulled initial footage from the school's surveillance system, Klein continued, his voice firm as he laid out a second set of images. These darker and grainier, but no less clear in their story. The camera caught the prank at the lockers, the boys cornering your daughters in the hallway, the shove that led to the fight in the courtyard. Between these, the witness statements from your neighbors, and the admissions made by a few students after we followed up, we have a strong case building in your favor. At his words, a quiet breath passed between Jada and Janelle. Not relief in the way of weakness, but in the form of a slow, patient exhale, as though they were allowing themselves, just for a moment, to feel the weight of the battle begin to lift from their shoulders. "And the Mallorys?" Derek asked, his voice low but steady, carrying the question not with desperation, but with the weight of responsibility. As a man who had never needed to shout to be heard, Klein's mouth tightened for a heartbeat before he answered, his words chosen carefully, but leaving no room for doubt. "They're in deep," he replied, his tone edged with quiet finality. "They came here full of bluster, thinking their story would carry weight on its own. But with this evidence, their accusations are falling apart fast. The more they talk, the deeper they dig their own hole." As Klein spoke, movement caught Derek's eye beyond the glass. Another officer entered the room where Sandra and Greg sat, a thick stack of papers in hand, setting them down on the table with a thud that seemed to ripple through the very air between them. Sandra's mouth moved, her words lost behind the glass, but her rising panic was plain to see, her gestures sharp and frantic as she tried to argue against the growing mountain of facts. Greg, for all his earlier rage, sat silent now, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, his hands clasped tightly together as though he could hold back the consequences by sheer force of will. "Let them see it all," Derek said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, though Klein heard him clearly and gave a small nod of agreement. "Let them see what happens when they push too far." "We intend to," Klein replied, closing the folder with a deliberate motion, as if sealing the fate of the Mallorys between its pages. "Let them see what happens when they push too far." "We intend to," Klein replied, closing the folder with a deliberate motion, as if sealing the fate of the Mallorys between its pages. Moments later, they were joined by another officer, this one younger, his uniform freshly pressed, but his expression already hardened by the realities of the job. He carried a printed transcript in his hands, placing it before Klein with a subtle nod. "Statements from 2 of the students," the officer explained, his voice steady. "They confirm prior harassment at the school, consistent with what Mr. Rivers and his daughters reported." Klein scanned the pages quickly, his eyes sharpening with every line he read. "That should be enough," he said at last, setting the papers down with a quiet weight that seemed to settle not just on the table, but in the air around them. "We'll be moving forward with charges. Assault, trespassing, possibly harassment, once the full scope at the school is established." Derek gave no outward reaction, his calm undisturbed, but Jada and Janelle felt the subtle shift in their father's posture, the quiet satisfaction of a man who had stood his ground, not for the sake of victory alone, but for justice itself. Sandra's voice, sharp even behind the glass, rose once more, a desperate sound with none of its earlier confidence. Greg's shoulders sagged further, his head lowering as if he could no longer bear the weight of the truth pressing down upon him from every side. Officer Klein turned back to Derek and his daughters, his expression settling into something almost respectful. "You've handled yourselves well," he said simply. "This won't be easy, and it's not finished yet. But you did the right thing." Derek inclined his head once, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than gratitude, for he had never fought for approval, only for what was right. As the officers moved to process the Mallorys, leading them from the interview room with firm, unyielding steps, the Rivers family remained seated, their eyes steady, their hearts aligned in quiet unity. The tide had not just turned, it had begun to sweep away the lies, exposing the truth beneath. And though the fight had yet to reach its final conclusion, they could see the end on the horizon, as sure and steady as the rising sun. And when that moment came, they would meet it together. The station held its breath beneath the weight of everything that had come to light, as if the very walls, the air itself, had grown heavy with the truth finally forced into the open, too real and too solid to be denied or reshaped by the hands of those who had once believed themselves untouchable. Derek, seated between his daughters, remained unmoving, his gaze steady as he watched the officers carry out their work. Their motions no longer hurried or uncertain, but deliberate, shaped by the clarity of evidence that had built, brick by brick, into an unbreakable wall around the Mallorys' crumbling defense. Across the room, through the narrow strip of glass that separated the main floor from the smaller holding area, Sandra paced like a caged animal, her hands twisting in tight fists at her sides, her eyes wild as they searched for something. Some gap in the wall, some thread to pull loose that might unravel the case closing fast around her, but there was nothing left for her to grasp. No more lies to spin that hadn't already tangled into knots too tight to escape. Greg, once loud and certain, now sat slumped in his chair, his elbows resting heavily on his knees, his head bowed low beneath the weight of failure. His eyes, dull and lost, stared at the floor as though the answers he sought might appear there, if only he stared hard enough. But he found nothing except the hollow echo of his own choices, staring back at him. Officer Klein stood at the center of it all, his posture firm, his expression sharpened by the finality of the moment. He flipped through the last of the statements and recordings gathered in the hours since the Mallorys had been brought in, his mind running through the full story laid bare before him. Neighbors' testimonies clear and consistent, camera footage from multiple angles painting an undeniable picture, student witnesses at the school filling in every gap that might have been left behind. He turned to Derek, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had endured to reach this point. "We've completed our preliminary findings," Klein began, his tone steady and without hesitation. "The charges against you and your daughters will be dropped immediately. The evidence leaves no room for any other decision." Jada and Janelle shared a glance, a silent moment of understanding passing between them, not of surprise, for they had always known their truth would prevail, but of quiet vindication, the kind that does not shout in triumph, but settles deep in the chest, steady and certain. Derek inclined his head slightly, his composure unshaken, though behind his calm exterior there was the faintest shift, a release of the tension he had carried for his daughters, for his family, every moment of this battle weighing on him more heavily than he would ever let show. "And the Mallorys?" Derek asked, not because he needed the answer, but because it mattered that the words were spoken plainly, out loud, for all to hear. Klein's gaze hardened as he responded. "They will face charges," he confirmed, unfolding each count with quiet precision as though placing stones on a scale. "Assault, harassment, trespassing, and obstruction. Their actions at the school and here at your home are well documented. They won't be talking their way out of this." As if to underline the statement, another officer stepped into the holding area, unlocking the door with a sharp twist of the key and motioning to Sandra and Greg to rise. Sandra's protests, sharp and rising in panic, fell flat against the steady commands of the officers, her words reduced to noise beneath the full weight of the law that now pressed down upon her. "You have no right," she cried, her voice cracking beneath the strain. But the officer guiding her offered no response, only the silent firmness of duty done without bias. Greg, drained of fight, rose slowly. His shoulders slumped as the cuffs clicked into place around his wrists, his gaze flicking to Derek for just a breath of a moment before falling away, unable to hold the eyes of the man he had underestimated so badly. The twins watched in silence, not gloating, not cheering, but with a deep, quiet satisfaction that grew from knowing they had stood firm against the storm and refused to be broken. They had answered hate not with fear, but with courage. They had answered violence not with surrender, but with strength that came from years of discipline and from the unshakable bond they shared with their father and with each other. As the Mallorys were led from the room, their departure heavy with finality, Officer Klein turned back to the family with a softer edge to his voice. "You've done well," he said, pausing as though weighing his words before adding, "You held your ground with honor. That matters more than you know." Derek gave no answer, needing none. His steady gaze followed the Mallorys until they disappeared through the exit, swallowed by the system they had thought would protect them, but which had, instead, revealed their true nature to the world. The station began to settle after that, the frantic energy of the day cooling into a calmer rhythm as officers filed reports and finalized the necessary paperwork. Klein assured Derek that the official exoneration documents would follow within the hour, and that the school, too, would be notified of the findings, though Derek already knew that battle was one he would gladly see through to the end. Jada and Janelle, though weary from the long hours of questioning and waiting, sat poised and unbowed, their eyes sharp, their shoulders squared as they prepared to leave the station behind, knowing full well that while this chapter had closed, the lessons they had carved into their spirits would never fade. As the three of them stood together, their silhouettes framed against the dimming light filtering through the station's windows, there was a quiet power in their unity, an unspoken promise that no matter what came next, they would meet it not as victims of someone else's story, but as the authors of their own. They had fought, they had endured, and they had won. The morning sun stretched across the front of Rosewood Hills Academy, casting long beams of light over the familiar paths and polished brick buildings. But today, the light seemed sharper, clearer, as though the air itself had been washed clean after a long, bitter storm. The courtyard, once the stage for silent stares and loud, cruel whispers, now held a different kind of weight, not heavy with menace, but filled with the quiet buzz of change, the kind that moves through a place not in loud shouts, but in the restless, nervous energy of those who know the ground beneath their feet has shifted. Word had spread faster than anyone could have expected, carried not by rumor, but by the undeniable facts that had emerged in the wake of the Mallorys' arrest, and the damning evidence laid bare for all to see. Students who had once laughed along with Ryan and his friends now gathered in cautious clusters, their voices lower, their eyes more careful as they glanced toward the entrance where the twins were expected to return. Teachers who had turned away from the harassment, who had chosen silence over intervention, now carried a stiffness in their movements, a quiet shame etched into their faces as they prepared for the inevitable reckoning. Inside the administrative office, Headmaster Harrington stood with his shoulders drawn tight beneath the weight of everything that had come crashing down upon his institution. He held in his hands the official reports delivered by the police department, reports that left no room for doubt or delay. His gaze drifted over the names listed beneath the bold, clear charges: Ryan Mallory, Zach Carver, Brent Larson, and beside them, the final inescapable recommendation: expulsion, effective immediately. Across from him sat Derek Rivers, calm and composed, his posture as steady as it had been in the station, his eyes unwavering as they met the headmaster's with quiet authority. Beside him, Jada and Janelle sat poised, their uniforms crisp, their faces set with the strength of those who had weathered the storm and emerged not just standing, but unbowed. "The board met early this morning," Harrington began, his voice carrying the tightness of a man forced to confront his own failures. "In light of the investigation's findings and the overwhelming evidence of harassment and assault against your daughters, the suspension has been rescinded, effective immediately. They will return to their classes today." He paused, clearing his throat as he shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers tightening over the edge of the papers. "Furthermore, the students responsible for the harassment and the attack have been expelled permanently." There was a beat of silence, not because it was needed, but because it felt right to let the words hang in the air, to let them settle fully before moving forward. Derek's voice, when he spoke, carried no triumph, no gloating satisfaction, only the deep, unwavering calm of a father who had fought for justice and now saw it delivered. "It's the decision that should have been made from the start," he said plainly, "not as an accusation, but as an undeniable truth." Harrington's lips tightened, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his eyes. Whether it was regret or embarrassment, or both, it was impossible to say. But he nodded, the gesture small but telling. "We failed your family," he admitted, his voice lower now, roughened by the weight of the truth. "We failed our duty to protect all our students. That will change." Jada's gaze held the headmaster's with the same clear steadiness that had carried her through every cruel word, every shove, every attempt to make her and her sister feel less than they were. "See that it does," she said, her words measured but firm, leaving no room for false promises. Beside her, Janelle's voice followed with equal strength. "Not just for us," she added, her eyes sharp and unwavering. "For every student who doesn't fit your mold." For a moment, Harrington seemed to falter beneath the weight of their words, but then he gave a shallow nod, the papers trembling slightly in his grasp as he finally set them aside. As they rose from their chairs, Derek placed a hand lightly on each of his daughter's shoulders, a quiet gesture of pride that needed no words to carry its meaning. Together, they stepped out of the office and into the main hallway, their footsteps echoing through the marble corridor that had once felt like a gauntlet but now felt more like a path cleared by their courage and determination. Students turned to watch them, some with open curiosity, others with quiet respect, and a few with lingering shame etched into their expressions as they recalled the roles they had played, whether through action or silence. But none dared speak. None dared mock or sneer. The weight of what had unfolded had left them no cover, no comfortable shadow to hide within. The twins walked side by side, their heads high, their shoulders straight, not as returning victims, but as champions of their own story, as proof that resilience in the face of cruelty can shatter even the strongest walls of prejudice. Outside the building, the morning breeze brushed against their faces, cool and clean, as if the very air recognized the shift that had come at last. Their father stepped alongside them, his presence as steady as ever, and together they crossed the courtyard, not with haste, but with the deliberate, confident pace of those who had earned every step forward. And as they moved, Derek's voice, low and sure, broke the quiet between them. "The storm is over," he said, not as a wish, but as a fact, as certain and unshakable as the sun rising over the horizon. "No," Jada answered, her eyes on the path ahead, her tone carrying the quiet strength that had carried her through the fire. "We ended it." Janelle's lips curved into the smallest, fiercest smile, her eyes bright beneath the morning light. "And we'll end it again," she added, "whenever it comes." Together, they crossed the threshold of the school, leaving behind the shadows of doubt and stepping fully into the light of justice. Finally done. And though the road ahead would always carry challenges, they knew with absolute certainty that whatever storms came next, they would meet them as they had met this one, together, unbroken, and unafraid. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so natural it almost felt as though the storm had never touched them, as if the winds of cruelty that had once blown so hard against their backs had at last quieted into nothing more than a distant memory. Yet Jada and Janelle never forgot. They did not carry the weight of what had happened as a burden, but as something far sharper and far stronger, a reminder of their own strength, woven into every step they took across the familiar paths of Rosewood Hills Academy. The school itself seemed changed in subtle ways, as though it had learned to breathe differently, the air no longer thick with the unspoken permission of cruelty. Teachers, once tight-lipped and quick to avert their eyes, now greeted the twins with a respect that felt earned rather than forced. They called their names in class not with indifference, but with genuine regard, their voices steady, their eyes meeting theirs without the old hesitation. Their classmates, too, had shed the shadows they had once worn so easily. No longer did the corridors echo with mocking laughter or sharp whispers. Instead, there were nods of acknowledgement, small but real, and quiet moments where silence felt like respect rather than avoidance. In the courtyard, where once they had walked beneath the weight of 1,000 judging eyes, Jada and Janelle now moved freely, their heads high, their steps unhurried. They sat beneath the old oak tree during lunch, sunlight warming their faces as they talked about everything and nothing at all, their voices light with the ease of those who no longer had to watch every word, every glance, every breath. It was not perfection, because they had never sought that. What they had now was something far better. Peace built not on fear, but on strength earned through fire. They knew that the battle they had fought had not only freed them, but had shifted something permanent in the very bones of the school itself, a quiet but unbreakable change that would endure long after the memory of the Mallorys faded. Their father's words stayed with them, not as distant echoes, but as living truths carried close to their hearts. "Stand your ground," he had told them, time and again, and they had done exactly that. Not just for themselves, but for every student who walked those same halls now and would walk them in the future. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the green lawn, the twins sat side by side, their laughter rising easy and unforced, their eyes bright with the simple joy of a day well lived. They had not just survived Rosewood Hills Academy, they had claimed it, and as they looked out over the grounds, at the place that had once tried to shrink them into silence, they saw only the wide, open horizon of the life they had built with their own hands, their own courage, their own unshakable bond. They had won, and they would keep on winning every single day. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have hand-picked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.